I spent 7 years and my entire life savings paying a profit to keep my husband's plane from crashing. Every time David took off for Emirates, I sent a security fee to a man who claimed he held the keys to the sky. I thought I was a martyr saving my family, until my husband landed in Egypt and opened our daughter's iCloud account. What he found in my hidden folder didn't just end our marriage. It exposed a $500,000 spiritual scam that will make your blood boil. If you think your pastor is praying for you for free, you're the next victim. Here's how I almost killed the man I loved to satisfy a demon in a suit. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The air inside the Sanctuary of Divine Echoes was thick with more than just the expensive humidity of a Lagos afternoon. It carried the cloying, heavy scent of frankincense mingled with something metallic, something that smelled like old copper and dried earth. Ifeoma sat on a velvet back chair that felt too soft, like a trap, her fingers digging into the leather of her handbag as she watched the ceiling fans churn the stagnant air into sluggish whirlpools. Prophet Zechariah did not enter the room so much as he manifested within it, his presence preceded by the rhythmic chime of brass bells and the hushed whispers of his acolytes who moved like shadows against the whitewashed walls. He was a man of impeccable tailoring, wearing a suit that shimmered with the subtle sheen of Italian silk, yet his eyes held a primal, ancient hunger that contradicted his modern exterior. As he took his seat across from her, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, a psychological chill that Ifeoma had learned to associate with the anointing, unaware that it was the calculated effect of the black magic he had woven into the very foundations of the building. He didn't ask her name or her business. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers with a predatory intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat, and he began to speak in a low, melodic cadence that sounded like a lullaby and a threat all at once. He spoke of her loneliness, of the 3 men who had broken her heart in the last 5 years, and of the silent tears she cried in her pillow at 3 a.m. when the rest of the city was a symphony of generator hums and distant sirens. Every word was a needle piercing a nerve, a precision-guided strike on her insecurities that left her feeling stripped bare, vulnerable, and utterly convinced that this man held the keys to a kingdom she had long been denied entry to. He reached into a small, ornate wooden box on his desk and pulled out a single, jagged shard of obsidian, placing it between them like a boundary marker between the mundane world and the miraculous. You are tired of walking the earth alone, Ifeoma, because you were meant to fly, he whispered, his voice vibrating with a frequency that seemed to hum in her very bones, a feat of both spiritual manipulation and raw, charismatic theater. He described a vision that he claimed was being broadcast directly from the heavens. A man in a crisp white uniform, a man who commanded the winds and lived among the clouds, a man whose heart was a fortress waiting for her to occupy it. This wasn't just a prediction. It was a psychological anchor he was dropping into the depths of her subconscious, ensuring that from this moment forward, every pilot she saw, every airplane streak in the sky, and every mention of travel would trigger a Pavlovian response of hope and indebtedness. He told her that this destiny was already written, but the ink was fading, and only his intercession, a cocktail of secret prayers and ritualistic insurance, could darken the lines enough to make them reality. As she left the sanctuary that day, the Lagos sun felt blindingly bright, and the world felt newly charged with a dangerous, artificial electricity. She didn't realize that she hadn't just received a prophecy. She had signed an invisible contract with a ghost. The prophet's smile as she walked away was not one of pastoral joy, but of a fisherman who felt the first, subtle tug on a line he intended to reel in for the rest of his life. A slow-motion capture of soul that believed it was finally being set free. For weeks following her encounter with Zechariah, Ifeoma moved through her life like a ghost haunting her own existence, her senses hyper-tuned to the specific frequency of the prophet's promise. She spent her mornings at her boutique in Lekki, but her mind was always elsewhere, scanning the faces of men in the coffee shops and the high-end lounges where the elite of Lagos congregated to trade stories of oil subsidies and real estate empires. The prophet had told her to watch for a sign of the horizon, a cryptic phrase that she turned over in her mind like a polished stone until it became the lens through which she viewed every interaction. She began to attend events she usually avoided, dressing in silks that felt like armor, her heart a drumbeat of anticipation that grew louder with every passing day that the man of the clouds failed to manifest. She returned to the sanctuary twice more, each time handing over envelopes of cash that felt heavier than the last, convinced by Zechariah's silver-tongued reassurances that the delay was merely the spiritual resistance of her enemies. He would perform elaborate rituals in her presence, chanting in a language that sounded like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone, while the air grew thick with the smell of ozone and sulfur, a sensory assault designed to bypass her logic and speak directly to her primal fears. He warned her that the manifestation of such a high-level blessing required constant lubrication, a metaphor for the extortion he was perfecting, telling her that the moment she doubted or stopped the flow of gratitude, the cosmic gears would grind to a halt and her destined lover would be diverted to another woman. Then, at a charity gala hosted at the Oriental Hotel, the horizon finally arrived in the form of a man standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the dark expanse of the Atlantic. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that seemed built to carry the weight of the sky and a smile that possessed a grounded, quiet confidence that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the Lagos socialites. When he introduced himself as David, a senior first officer for Emirates, Ifeoma felt a physical shock go through her body, a violent confirmation of Zechariah's accuracy that sent a wave of ecstatic terror through her veins. David spoke of his life in Dubai, of the serenity of the cockpit at midnight over the Mediterranean, and the way the stars looked when you were high enough to touch the hem of heaven. And Ifeoma felt herself falling not just for the man, but for the prophecy itself. Every word he spoke felt like a verse from the script Zechariah had written, and she was so blinded by the miracle that she failed to see the human being standing in front of her, seeing instead a divine trophy she had purchased with her fear. By the end of the evening, as they exchanged numbers under the amber glow of the chandelier, Ifeoma was already mentally calculating the next payment she would owe the prophet for this delivery. She felt a surge of love for David that was inextricably tangled with a paralyzing fear of Zechariah, a dual engine of emotion that would power her life for the next 7 years, never realizing that the man she was falling for was a real person with his own soul, not a puppet moved by the strings of a charlatan's dark art. The courtship between Ifeoma and David was a whirlwind of international departures and whispered promises that seemed to defy the gravity of ordinary life. David was a man of the air, possessing a grounded serenity that made the chaotic pulse of Lagos feel like a distant hum whenever he was near. He took her to dinners at the Eco-Atlantic, where the salt spray of the ocean blurred the lines between the sky and the sea, and he spoke of his dreams not as fantasies, but as flight plans already in motion. For Ifeoma, every moment spent with him felt like a confirmation of Prophet Zechariah's divinity. She looked at David's crisp Emirates uniform, the gold braid and the steady hands, and saw not just a man she was falling for, but a miracle she was renting from a higher, darker power. Their love was a high-altitude intoxication, a blend of first-class lounges in Dubai and quiet strolls through the botanical gardens of Singapore. Yet beneath the glamour, Ifeoma carried a hidden ledger of debt. Every time David held her hand, she felt the invisible weight of the prophet's influence, a silent third party in their romance who demanded a percentage of her joy as interest on his prophecy. She began to believe that David's very safety in the cockpit was tied to her faithfulness to the sanctuary, transforming her burgeoning love into a desperate act of spiritual preservation that she could never share with a logical, science-minded man who occupied her heart. As the engagement ring, a brilliant solitaire that caught the light like a star, slid on her finger, the psychological trap snapped shut with the finality of a bank vault. That night, while David slept with the peacefulness of a man who believed he had won her heart through merit and chemistry. Iphioma lay awake in the blue light of her phone, reading a text from the prophet that simply said, "The harvest is ready. Do not forget the hand that planted the seed." The request for the marital sealing fee was staggering, a sum that would have bought a small fleet of cars in Lagos. Yet Iphioma didn't hesitate to begin liquidating her business savings. She justified the extortion as a necessary sacrifice, a way to insulate her future from the reversal the prophet so frequently warned about in his thunderous Sunday sermons. She was living in a beautiful, gilded paradox where her greatest happiness was also her greatest source of terror, convinced that the moment she stopped paying the prophet, the engine of her life would flame out and drop her back into the abyss of loneliness. Her love for David was real, raw, and deep, but it was being cultivated in the shadow of a lie, a secret garden where the soil was enriched by black magic and the air was thick with the scent of an impending, inevitable death. The wedding was a spectacle of Lagosian opulence that people talked about for months, a sea of champagne-colored lace and high society whispers that filled the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental. David looked every bit the Prince Zechariah had promised, standing at the altar with a devotion in his eyes that should have made Iphioma feel like the luckiest woman on earth. But as she walked down the aisle, her gaze kept drifting to the back of the hall, where Prophet Zechariah sat like a silent gargoyle in a custom-fitted white caftan, his presence a dark anchor in a room full of light. He didn't smile. He merely watched, his eyes tracking the exchange of rings and the signing of the registry, as if he were observing a business transaction being finalized. During the reception, when the music was at its loudest and the joy was most palpable, he pulled Iphioma aside into a quiet alcove, the smell of his heavy, metallic cologne cutting through the floral arrangements like a knife. He whispered that the spiritual canopy he had placed over the union was temporary and that the first tithe of the covenant was due before the moon set, a demand that turned her wedding bliss into a cold, calculated exercise in crisis management. The tithe was not a donation, but a ransom, a massive transfer of funds that Iphioma had to facilitate through a series of offshore accounts her brother had helped her set up for her boutique. As the dancers whirled and the champagne flowed, Iphioma slipped away to her bridal suite, her hands trembling as she authorized the transfer of nearly half of the wedding gift's cash value and a significant portion of her personal dowry. She felt a sickening sense of vertigo, a realization that her marriage was being built on a foundation of blackmail, yet the fear of scattering, a term Zechariah used to describe the total destruction of one's achievements, was more powerful than her sense of logic. She returned to the party with a plastic smile, dancing with David while her mind raced with the logistical nightmare of how she would continue to hide these massive drains on her finances once they shared household. David spun her around the floor, whispering about their future in Dubai and the children they would have, entirely unaware that his wife had just paid a king's ransom to a sorcerer to ensure that his plane wouldn't fall out of the sky on their honeymoon flight. It was the first of many silences that would grow between them, a wall of glass that was invisible to David but cold and impenetrable to Iphioma, who was beginning to realize that the prophet's blessings were the most expensive things she would ever own. Prophet Zechariah's empire was built on more than just charismatic oratory. It was a sophisticated architecture of fear, powered by a network of informants and a deep, dark mastery of the occult. In the basement of his sprawling compound in Ogudu, away from the cameras and the cheering crowds of his televised services, lay the inner chamber, a room where the air was thick with the copper tang of ritual sacrifice and the low, rhythmic chanting of his acolytes. Here, he kept what he called the books of life, leather-bound ledgers that contained the intimate secrets and financial vulnerabilities of every high-profile member of his congregation. Zechariah understood that modern Nigerians lived in a state of high-stakes anxiety, the fear of failing after finally making it, and he leveraged this insecurity with the precision of a surgeon. His black magic was a blend of psychological warfare and genuine, ancient ritual. He used charms and monitors, spiritually charged objects disguised as gifts or blessed water, to keep his victims in a state of hypervigilance. Iphioma was just one of thousands, a node in a vast web of extortion that funded his private jets and his properties in London. Yet he made her feel as though she were his most special project, a tactic that ensured her loyalty through a twisted sense of divine intimacy. The genius of Zechariah's manipulation was that he never took full credit for the good things that happened, only for preventing the bad things that should have happened. He convinced Iphioma that David's successful landings in heavy fog, his promotion to captain, and even the health of their elderly parents were all direct results of the protective shield he maintained through her financial contributions. He would call her at odd hours, usually when David was on a long-haul flight to New York or London, and describe visions of turbulence or mechanical failure that he had thwarted through intense midnight prayer. This created a Pavlovian response in Iphioma. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would skip a beat, her mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario involving David's safety. She began to see the prophet's face in the patterns of the clouds and hear his voice in the hum of the air conditioner, a total psychological saturation that made the idea of buying out or leaving the church feel like a death sentence. Zechariah's power was not in the miracles he performed, but in the catastrophes he promised to withhold, a protection racket that operated under the guise of Pentecostal fire, ensuring that his victims would keep paying as long as they had something left to lose. Life as a pilot's wife in the gleaming skyscrapers of Dubai was a stark contrast to the spiritual darkness Iphioma left behind in Lagos. Yet the distance did little to dampen the prophet's reach. While David was navigating the complex airspaces of Europe and Asia, Iphioma was navigating the increasingly complex web of lies required to keep her payments to Zechariah a secret. Her boutique in Lagos, which she now managed remotely, became the primary vehicle for her tithes, as she inflated invoices and created ghost suppliers to explain the missing revenue. She lived in a constant state of dual consciousness. To David, she was the supportive, elegant partner who managed their home with grace. To Zechariah, she was a terrified daughter who spent her nights on Zoom calls, listening to his veiled threats wrapped in scriptures of prosperity. The loneliness of the pilot's wife, the long nights when the house was silent and the only connection to her husband was a flight tracking app, made her even more vulnerable to the prophet's psychological hooks. She would watch the little plane icon representing David's flight move across the digital map of the Atlantic, whispering the protective prayers Zechariah had sold her, convinced that her voice and her money were the only things keeping that icon from disappearing. David, meanwhile, was the picture of rational, modern success, a man who believed in aerodynamics, weather patterns, and the meticulous maintenance of his Boeing 777. He adored Iphioma with a purity that made her feel like a criminal. He would return from trips with gifts from every corner of the globe, silk scarves from Florence, perfumes from Paris, electronics from Tokyo, never realizing that his wife was selling her peace of mind to keep him in the air. He noticed her growing obsession with her phone and her frequent, whispered conversations in the other room, but he attributed it to the stress of her business and the difficulty of adjusting to life away from her family. He tried to be more present, taking her on weekend getaways to the desert or the mountains of Oman. But even there, in the silence of the dunes, Iphioma could feel the prophet's eyes on her. She had become an expert at the mask, a performance of domestic bliss that was so convincing she sometimes almost believed herself, until the next emergency seed request would arrive, pulling her back into the cold reality of her enslavement. The clouds that David flew through were made of water and ice, but the clouds Iphioma lived in were made of guilt and superstition, a fog so thick she no longer knew how to find her way back to the truth. When Iphioma discovered she was pregnant, the joy she felt was immediately eclipsed by a cold, sharp dread. She knew the prophet would see the child as a new form of leverage. Zechariah's reaction was exactly what she feared. He claimed that he had negotiated the child's soul from the realm of the unborn and that a preservation sacrifice was required to ensure the baby was born with all 10 fingers and a sound mind. During the 9 months of her pregnancy, Iphioma's payments tripled, as she was forced to pay for wound watchers and ancestral cleansings that the prophet insisted were necessary to protect the child from David's unbelieving lineage. She became obsessed with the baby's safety, following the prophet's instructions to the letter, drinking blessed oils and wearing a hidden red thread around her waist, all while hiding her physical and emotional distress from David. When Maya was finally born, a beautiful, healthy girl with David's eyes and Iphioma's stubborn chin, the prophet claimed the victory as his own, telling Iphioma that the child's very breath was a gift she had to keep paying for. The birth of Maya changed the stakes of the game entirely. Iphioma was no longer just protecting her husband. She was protecting her child's future. David was a doting father, overwhelmed by the miracle of his daughter, and he insisted on setting up a shared family iCloud account so they could both see every photo and video of Maya's first years, regardless of where he was in the world. Iphioma agreed, not realizing that this digital bridge would eventually become the path to her undoing. She continued to manage the prophet's demands, but the dedication fee he required for Maya's first birthday was so massive it forced her to dip into the college fund David had started for the girl. She felt a piece of her soul die with every transfer, a slow-motion erosion of her integrity that left her feeling hollowed out and weary. Maya was the light of their lives, a radiant, laughing toddler who brought David and Iphioma closer than ever. Yet she was also the most powerful weapon Zechariah had ever used against her. Every time Iphioma looked at her daughter, she saw the price tag the prophet had placed on her head, a debt that seemed to grow faster than the child herself, turning the sanctuary of their home into a warehouse for a madman's greed. By the time Maya was 3, the financial strain of Iphioma's secret life began to manifest as visible cracks in the facade of their perfect Dubai lifestyle. Iphioma's boutique in Lagos was now a hollow shell, its profits entirely diverted to Zechariah's ministry, and she had begun to invent elaborate stories about bad investments and currency devaluations to explain why she needed David to cover more of their household expenses. She was a woman drowning in plain sight, her skin losing its luster and her eyes always darting toward her reflection as if searching for the woman she used to be before the prophet claimed her. The psychological toll was even worse. She began to suffer from nightmares where David's plane turned into a giant, metallic bird that Zechariah controlled with a set of velvet puppet strings. She was becoming a stranger to herself, a person who could look her husband in the eye and lie about a $10,000 transfer while simultaneously planning his surprise birthday party. The cognitive dissonance was a poison, a slow-acting toxin that made her feel unworthy of the very love she was sacrificing everything to protect. David, ever the observant pilot, began to sense a shift in the atmospheric pressure of their marriage, though he couldn't quite pinpoint the source of the turbulence. He saw the way Iphioma flinched when the doorbell rang, the way she guarded her laptop like it was a state secret, and the subtle, persistent anxiety that seemed to vibrate off her like heat from a tarmac. He tried to talk to her, to offer help with her business troubles, but she would always shut him down with a brittle laugh and a promise that everything was under control. He began to wonder if there was another man, a thought that pained him more than he could express, but he quickly dismissed it. Their physical and emotional intimacy, though strained, still felt grounded in a truth he couldn't ignore. He didn't realize that the other man was a ghost from her past, a spiritual predator who lived thousands of miles away but occupied the most intimate spaces of her mind. The shadow on the ledger wasn't just about money. It was the shadow of a life lived in a state of permanent apology, a woman who felt she had to buy the right to be happy, never realizing that true love is the only thing that can never be sold. From the flight deck of his Boeing 777-300R, the world looked deceptively simple to David, a grid of lights and natural features governed by the laws of physics and the steady hand of experience. He loved the clarity of the cockpit, the way every switch had a purpose and every warning light had a checklist for resolution. It was a sanctuary of logic in a world that often felt increasingly chaotic. As he crossed the point of no return on a flight to Tokyo, his mind drifted back to Iphioma and the strange, haunting distance that had grown between them over the last few years. He remembered her as the vibrant, fearless woman he had met at the gala in Lagos. But lately, she seemed like a fading photograph, her colors washed out by an invisible rain. He felt a deep, protective urge toward her, a desire to pull her out of whatever storm she was hiding in. Yet he was a man trained to respect boundaries and trust his crew. He spent his layovers in quiet contemplation, wandering through foreign cities and wondering if his life of constant travel had inadvertently created a void that Ifeoma was struggling to fill. David's love for Ifeoma was the North Star of his existence, the fixed point around which his entire life rotated, and he refused to believe that their connection was anything less than extraordinary. He often thought about the destiny she sometimes mentioned, the idea that they were meant to be together. And while he didn't share her superstitious leanings, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the series of coincidences that had led him to her. He was a man of science who nevertheless believed in the magic of a perfect landing and the miracle of a child's laughter, and he was determined to find a way to bridge the gap that was widening in his marriage. He didn't know that the storm he sensed was a man-made hurricane, a spiritual entrapment that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the woman he loved. He planned to take a month of leave, a grounding of sorts, to focus entirely on Ifeoma and Maya, hoping that the sheer force of his presence would be enough to chase away the shadows. He was a pilot who had survived engine failures and bird strikes, but he was completely unprepared for the digital ghost that was about to appear on his screen, a signal he couldn't ignore and a crash he wouldn't be able to prevent. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, a day that began with the mundane normalcy of a school run and a quiet breakfast. Ifeoma had missed a security payment to the Prophet the previous week, a sum she had intended to pay but was delayed because of a banking glitch in Nigeria, and the retaliation from Zechariah was swift and terrifying. He sent her a voice note that wasn't a prayer, but a curse, his voice distorted and low, telling her that the protective circle around David was breaking and that she would soon see the blood of her negligence on the horizon. 2 hours later, Ifeoma received a frantic call from David's airline. His flight from London had been diverted to Gander due to a minor technical anomaly in the engine's oil pressure system. Though the plane landed safely and no one was hurt, the coincidence was too much for Ifeoma's fragile psyche to handle. She collapsed in the hallway of their Dubai apartment, the phone slipping from her hand as she realized that the Prophet's powers were either real or he was a man capable of sabotaging a global airline from his compound in Lagos. The terror was absolute. She felt like a murderer who had almost succeeded, convinced that her greed in holding back the money had almost cost David his life. She immediately emptied her secret emergency fund, a collection of jewelry and cash she had been hiding for years, and sent it to Zechariah with a plea for mercy that was pathetic in its desperation. The Prophet's response was a chilling demand for a buyout, a final astronomical payment that would supposedly free her from his covenant forever, a sum so large it would require her to sell her boutique and take out a massive loan against her and David's shared assets. Ifeoma was trapped. The cracks in the porcelain were no longer just aesthetic. The entire structure of her life was beginning to crumble under the weight of her fear. She began the process of a buyout in a trance-like state, her mind shattered by the near loss of David and the unrelenting pressure of the Prophet's demands. She didn't realize that Zechariah had no intention of letting her go. He was simply preparing to harvest the last of her resources before discarding her. David returned home 2 days later, shaken by the engine incident, but relieved to be alive, only to find his wife a shell of herself, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold a teacup. He tried to comfort her, but she pulled away, the guilt of what she was about to do, the final financial betrayal of their family, burning in her throat like acid. The digital thread that would unravel 7 years of deception was woven into the very fabric of their family's daily life. The shared iCloud account they had created for Maya. For years, it had been a source of joy, a repository for first steps, birthday parties, and holiday videos that synced across their phones, iPads, and David's laptop. Ifeoma, in her state of mounting panic and cognitive decline, had begun to use her phone's hidden folder to store screenshots of the prophet's threats and records of her payments, a misguided attempt to keep a record just in case she ever found the courage to fight back. She believed the hidden album was safe, unaware that a recent software update had changed the sync settings, making hidden folders visible and accessible across all devices signed into the family account. As David prepared for a flight to Cairo, a trip he hoped would give him the clarity to finally confront Ifeoma about her behavior, his iPad, resting on the bedside table, quietly began to download a massive backlog of data that Ifeoma had thought was buried forever in the digital ether. The synchronization was a silent, invisible process, a stream of bits and bytes carrying the evidence of 1,000 betrayals across the airwaves. While Maya slept in the next room, and Ifeoma sat in the kitchen, staring at the paperwork for the sale of her boutique, David's devices were being populated with the anatomy of her secret life. He saw the buyout demand from Zechariah, a document titled The Final Covenant of Release, and the screenshots of the prophet's voice notes, where he threatened to bring down the sky if Ifeoma didn't pay. He saw the bank transfers, the ghost invoices, and the frantic messages where Ifeoma begged for David's life, as if he were a prisoner of war rather than a pilot in the prime of his career. The cloud, once a place for their most precious memories, had become a digital crime scene, an archive of a marriage built on a foundation of terror and extortion. David didn't see the notifications before he left for the airport. He kissed Ifeoma goodbye, his heart heavy with a sense of impending loss he couldn't explain, and boarded his flight to Cairo, unaware that the ghost he had been sensing in his home was now riding in his flight bag, waiting for the moment he touched down in the shadow of the pyramids to reveal its true, horrifying face. The final demand from Prophet Zechariah arrived not as a whisper, but as a financial ultimatum that felt like a death warrant. He called it the covenant of perpetual release, a blasphemous distortion of scripture that claimed Ifeoma could permanently sever her debt to the spiritual realm with one final, astronomical payment. The sum he demanded was enough to buy a luxury villa in the heart of Dubai, a figure so predatory it would require Ifeoma to liquidate every asset she had ever built, including the legal sale of her thriving boutique in Lagos and the depletion of her secret reserves. Zechariah sat in his office, the air heavy with the scent of burning herbs and expensive leather, his eyes reflecting a cold, calculating void as he explained that this was the only way to ensure David's plane never encountered another anomaly. He used the recent engine incident in Gander as a psychological hammer, beating Ifeoma into a state of total compliance until she was willing to sign away her future just to buy her husband another day of life. She moved through the process of the sale like a woman walking to her own execution, the legal documents for the boutique feeling like sandpaper against her skin as she surrendered the only thing she had ever owned that wasn't tied to David or the prophet. The madness of the buyout was fueled by a distorted kind of love, a sacrificial fire that was consuming Ifeoma from the inside out. She spent her days in a fog of international bank transfers and hushed conversations with lawyers in Lagos, all while maintaining the facade of a happy wife in their Dubai penthouse. Every time Maya laughed or David kissed her forehead before leaving for a flight, she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, knowing that she was essentially bankrupting their family security to pay off a ghost. She had been conditioned for 7 years to believe that her money was the literal fuel keeping David's engines running, a delusion that Zechariah reinforced with every terrifying text message and voice note. She didn't see the transaction as a loss of wealth, but as a purchase of peace, a desperate hope that once the money was gone, the prophet would finally vanish from her life, leaving her alone to love her husband without the shadow of a curse hanging over his cockpit. She was a woman drowning in a sea of her own devotion, unaware that the release she was buying was a fiction, and that the man she was trying to protect was about to discover that the greatest danger to his life wasn't a mechanical failure, but the secret his wife was dying to keep. David walked through Terminal 3 of Dubai International Airport with the rhythmic practice step of a man who had spent a third of his life on the move. Flight EK928 to Cairo was a routine 4-hour hop, a flight he had performed 100 times. Yet today the air felt different, charged with a subtle, subsonic tension that he couldn't quite name. He settled into the left seat of the Boeing 777, his hands moving over the switches with a muscle memory that was both comforting and hollow, his mind drifting back to the way Ifeoma had looked at him that morning. She had held on to him a second too long, her eyes searchlight bright and rimmed with a desperation that made his heart ache, and as the engines roared to life, he felt a sudden, irrational urge to cancel the flight and go back to her. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the pre-flight checklists and the crackle of the radio. But as the plane climbed through the layers of dust and heat toward the cool, thin air of the upper atmosphere, the feeling of impending change only intensified. He watched the horizon turn from a hazy orange to a deep, royal blue, a pilot's sanctuary where the logic of physics usually drowned out the complexities of the heart, unaware that his iPad, tucked safely in his flight bag, was already beginning to sync the data that would change the trajectory of his life forever. The flight was uneventful by any technical standard. The weather over the Saudi peninsula was clear, the engines hummed in perfect synchronicity, and the cabin was a quiet hum of sleeping passengers and flickering movie screens. But inside the cockpit, David felt a growing sense of isolation, a realization that he was flying a multi-million-dollar machine across continents, while his own home was a mystery he couldn't solve. He thought about Maya, her face appearing on a screensaver, and then he thought about the family iCloud account he had set up to keep them all connected, a digital bridge he had built out of love and a desire for transparency. He imagined Ifeoma at home, perhaps looking at the same photos of Maya that he was, never dreaming that the hidden folder update was currently bypassing her privacy settings in the background. As the descent into Cairo began, and the lights of the ancient city started to twinkle like fallen stars along the banks of the Nile, David felt a strange peace, the calm before a storm he didn't know was coming. He landed the plane with a surgeon's precision, the tires kissing the tarmac of Cairo International, and as he taxied to the gate, he reached for his iPad to check his messages, the first step into a digital labyrinth that would lead him directly into the heart of his wife's secret nightmare. The Marriott Mina House in Cairo is a place where history feels heavy, the Great Pyramid of Giza looming over the lush gardens like a silent, stone witness to the passage of time. David checked into his room, the fatigue of the flight settling into his bones, and sat on the edge of the bed with his iPad, intending to record a video message from Maya before the time difference grew too wide. As the device connected to the hotel's high-speed Wi-Fi, a cascade of notifications began to ripple across the screen, not just the usual emails and flight updates, but a series of photo and document syncs that seemed out of place. He opened the Photos app, expecting to see new pictures of Maya playing in the park, but instead his screen was flooded with screenshots of bank transfers to an account labeled The Sanctuary of Echoes. Confused, he scrolled further, and the air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He saw images of a man he recognized as Prophet Zechariah, followed by a series of text messages that read like a script from a psychological thriller. The messages were filled with threats of plane crashes, blood sacrifices, and demands for sums of money that made David's head spin, all addressed to his wife, his Ifeoma, who had been responding with a level of terror that broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. He sat in the shadow of the pyramids, the ancient monuments of ego and afterlife, and watched 7 years of his marriage dissolve into a digital archive of extortion. He saw the buyout contract, the legal papers for the sale of Ifeoma's boutique, and the voice notes where Zechariah claimed credit for David's safety in the air, mocking the very skills David had spent a lifetime perfecting. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Ifeoma hadn't been distant because she was falling out of love. She had been distant because she was a prisoner of war, fighting a silent, lonely battle to keep him alive. He looked at the bank totals, the millions of naira and hundreds of thousands of dirhams that had been bled out of their lives, and he felt a searing rage directed not at Ifeoma, but at the monster who had weaponized her love. He saw pictures of Maya that Iphioma had sent the prophet, accompanied by pleas for the child's protection, and he felt a wave of nausea at the thought of this man's shadow falling over his daughter's cradle. David didn't sleep that night. He paced the room, the Nile outside his window a dark, flowing vein of history, as he reconstructed the last 7 years of his life through the lens of a predator's greed and a woman's desperate, sacrificial devotion. As the sun began to rise over the Giza Plateau, painting the pyramids in shades of rose and gold, David began the agonizing process of auditing his own life, piece by digital piece. He sat with a notebook from the hotel desk, meticulously cross-referencing the dates of Iphioma's largest payments to the prophet with the dates of his own career milestones and close calls in the air. He found a transfer for $20,000 made the day after his first flight as a captain, and another even larger sum paid the morning of the engine incident in Gander. The cruelty of the timing was staggering. Zechariah had been monitoring David's life through Iphioma, using his successes as leverage for more money and his minor setbacks as proof of spiritual attacks. David realized that every promotion he had celebrated, every safe landing he had made, and every bonus he had brought home had been immediately cannibalized by the prophet, turned into attacks on his very existence. He felt a profound sense of violation, the realization that his most private moments of joy and professional pride had been used as weapons against the person he loved most in the world. The betrayal David felt was a complex, multi-layered emotion. He was angry that Iphioma hadn't trusted him with the truth, yet he was overcome with a crushing empathy for the psychological cage she had been living in. He imagined her sitting in their beautiful home, watching the clock and waiting for his safe landing message, all while a sorcerer in Lagos whispered in her ear that he held the power to make that message never come. He saw the monitors the prophet had sent, small, strange charms Iphioma had tucked into his luggage over the years, which he had dismissed as harmless tokens of her faith. Now, they looked like tracking devices for a soul, a way for Zechariah to occupy the cockpit, even when David was thousands of miles away. He looked at his hands, the hands of a pilot who prided himself on control, and realized he had been a passenger in a narrative written by a con man. By the time the hotel staff knocked with breakfast, David had reached a state of cold, crystalline clarity. He didn't care about the lost money or the sold boutique. He only cared about the woman who had spent 7 years in a burning building to make sure he never felt the heat of the flames. The confrontation happened over a video call, a medium too cold and fragile for the weight of the words that needed to be spoken. Iphioma answered with a tentative smile, her face framed by the soft lighting of their Dubai living room. But the moment she saw David's eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a terrifying, ancient sadness, the smile vanished. David didn't lead with accusations. He simply held his iPad up to the camera, showing her the covenant of perpetual release document she had signed only days before. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the digital connection until Iphioma's breath hitched and she let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush, telling him about the reversals, the curses, and the prophet's ability to see into the very engines of his plane. She confessed to selling the boutique, to the years of security fees, and to the paralyzing fear that if she ever stopped, the sky would open up and swallow him whole. David watched her on the screen, his heart breaking as he saw the woman he loved reduced to a trembling, superstitious shadow of her former self. He told her, his voice a low, vibrating growl of pain, that he would rather have crashed 10 times over than have her live a single day in that kind of terror. He told her that her sacrifice wasn't a noble act, but a betrayal of the partnership they had sworn to uphold, a choice to trust a charlatan's magic over her husband's strength. The argument was a hurricane of emotion, Iphioma crying that he didn't understand the spiritual world, and David shouting that the only spirit in their house was the spirit of a coward who preyed on women's hearts. By the end of the call, both were exhausted, the bridge between them seemingly burned to the ground by the heat of the truth. David hung up the phone and stared out of the Cairo skyline, feeling more alone than he ever had in a cockpit at midnight. While Iphioma collapsed on their kitchen floor, the mask finally shattered, leaving her exposed to the very silence she had spent 7 years trying to outrun. During the remainder of his layover, David became a ghost in the streets of Cairo, wandering through the Khan El-Khalili market without seeing the gold or smelling the spices. He walked along the Nile at dusk, watching the feluccas glide over the water like paper boats, and he wrestled with the fundamental question of their existence. Was their love real, or was it a byproduct of a prophecy that had been paid for in installments? He realized that Iphioma's belief in the prophet was so deep that she might never truly feel safe without his protection, a thought that filled him with a cold, hollow dread. He thought about the true love he had always believed they shared, the quiet mornings, the shared dreams for Maya, the way she knew his thoughts before he spoke them, and he wondered if that, too, was just a part of the package Zechariah had promised. He sat on a stone bench near the river and watched an old man fishing with a simple line, a stark contrast to the complex, high-altitude life he led, and he realized that love wasn't a transaction or a destiny. It was a choice made every single day in the face of uncertainty. The silence of the Nile became a period of profound philosophical calibration for David, a man who had always relied on instruments to tell him where he was. He realized that Iphioma hadn't paid the prophet because she was weak, but because her love for David was so vast it had made her vulnerable to the ultimate form of emotional blackmail. She had been willing to live a lie, to lose her business, and to sacrifice her own peace just to ensure he came home to her every night. The anger he felt began to transmute into a fierce, protective compassion. He didn't want to leave her. He wanted to rescue her from the wreckage of the prophet's influence. He saw that their love wasn't a product of Zechariah's words, but the very reason Zechariah had been able to exploit her in the first place, the true love, had always been there, independent of the magic, a luminous core that the prophet had merely tried to claim credit for. David stood up, his resolve hardening like the stones of the pyramids behind him, and he knew that his mission wasn't just to fly a plane back to Dubai, but to go back to Lagos and dismantle the sanctuary of lies that had tried to steal his family's soul. While David was in Cairo, Iphioma underwent a transformation of her own, the kind that only happens when the thing you fear most has already happened. Now that David knew the truth, the prophet's primary weapon, the threat of exposure, was gone, and in its place was a cold, sharp-edged clarity that Iphioma had never felt before. She didn't stay in Dubai to hide. Instead, she boarded a flight to Lagos, her heart a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of purpose. She arrived at the Sanctuary of Echoes not as a supplicant, but as an inquisitor, walking past the armed guards and the weeping congregants with a directness that unsettled the prophet's acolytes. She forced her way into Zechariah's inner sanctum, finding him surrounded by the trappings of his ill-gotten wealth, and she didn't wait for him to speak. She threw the buyout contract on his desk and told him, her voice as steady as a pilot's during a storm, that his power was over because she was no longer afraid of the dark. Zechariah tried to regain control, his voice dropping into that familiar, hypnotic register as he spoke of judgment and the crashing of planes. But Iphioma only laughed, a sound that cut through the incense-heavy air like a fresh breeze. She told him that she had seen the true face of a miracle in her husband's eyes and in her daughter's smile, and that a man who needed money to protect love was a man who knew nothing of either. She warned him that David had the digital records of every transfer, every threat, and every extortionate demand, and that the modern world, the world of flight data and international banking, was coming for his ancient, shadow-filled empire. As she walked out of the sanctuary for the last time, she felt a physical weight lift from her shoulders, a sensation of flight that had nothing to do with airplanes. She realized that the prophet had never had any power at all. He was just a mirror reflecting her own fears back at her, and now that she had broken a mirror, she was finally free to see herself for who she truly was, a woman who was loved not because of a prophecy, but because of her own beautiful, flawed, and resilient heart. David's return flight from Cairo to Dubai was the most significant journey of his career, a descent into truth that felt more like an ascent. As he piloted the massive aircraft through the night sky, he looked out at the stars and realized that the magic of flight wasn't in the engines or the wings, but in the trust that the passengers placed in the crew and the trust the crew placed in each other. He thought about Ifeoma and the courage it must have taken for her to face him, and then to face the prophet, and he felt a surge of pride that washed away the last vestiges of his anger. He wasn't returning to a wife who had betrayed him, but to a woman who had fought a war for him, and he was determined to spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt she had to fight alone again. The landing in Dubai was the smoothest of his life, a greaser that felt like a benediction, and as he walked through the terminal, he felt a lightness in his step that he hadn't known in 7 years. He found Ifeoma waiting for him at the arrival's gate, her face tired but her eyes clear and unburdened by the mask she had worn for so long. They didn't speak at first. They simply held each other in the middle of the crowded terminal, a pilot in his uniform and a woman who had sold her world to keep him in it. David whispered in her hair that he knew everything, and that everything included the fact that she was the bravest person he had ever known. He told her that they would get the money back, or they wouldn't, and it didn't matter, because the only currency that carried any weight in their home from now on would be the truth. As they drove home through the neon-lit streets of Dubai, with the Burj Khalifa standing like a needle of light against the black sky, David realized that the distance between them had never been a result of her secret, but a result of the fear that the secret had created. Now that the fear was gone, the distance had vanished, leaving only the two of them and the realization that their love had never been a product of a prophet's decree, but a miracle they had created all on their own. It was a quiet morning in their penthouse, the sun reflecting off the Persian Gulf in a blinding sheet of silver. They spent the day as a family, Maya sensing the shift in the atmosphere and laughing with a renewed vigor that seemed to fill every corner of the apartment. They didn't talk about the prophet or the money. Instead, they talked about the future, about rebuilding Ifeoma's business on a foundation of honesty, about travel plans where David was just a passenger, and about the simple, profound joy of being together without a debt hanging over their heads. David took Ifeoma's hands in his and told her that he had looked through every flight log and every maintenance report from the last 7 years, and he realized that the anomalies and technical issues the prophet had used to terrify her were just the normal, manageable friction of a life lived at 35,000 feet. He showed her that the miracle of his safety wasn't a spiritual transaction, but a result of his training, the engineer's skill, and the quiet, unwavering love she had given him every time he walked out the door. In the end, the story of Ifeoma and David wasn't a story of a prophet's power, but a story of true love all along. A love that was so powerful it had survived 7 years of psychological warfare and spiritual extortion. They realized that Zechariah hadn't given them each other. He had simply tried to tax a bond that was already written in the stars long before they ever stepped into his sanctuary. The realization was a liberation, a dismantling of the shadows that allowed them to see their life for what it truly was, a beautiful, unpredictable journey that didn't need a pilot's prophecy to find its way home. As the sun set over the Dubai skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the room, Ifeoma looked at David and saw not a man of the clouds or a prince of the horizon, but a man she had chosen, and who had chosen her every single day. They were no longer victims of a dark magic, but masters of their own destiny, two souls who had learned that the only true protection in a dangerous world is the courage to be honest, the strength to forgive, and the knowledge that love, when it is real, is the only miracle anyone ever needs. We think love is a blessing, but for me, it was a ransom note. David finally knows the truth, but the prophet just sent me a final message that proves this nightmare is far from over. Is your partner keeping a protection secret from you? Go to the comments and tell me. Is it true love if it's built on a lie, or am I just as guilty as the pastor? Click the link in my bio for the leaked voice notes of the prophet's threats. You won't believe the reversal he's planning next. Watch part 2 now before the church's lawyers have this taken down.